Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to my Facebook Live session. I have these sessions every other Friday at 4 p.m. UK time, and you can tune in then. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Today, we're going to be talking about what levels of consciousness are you operating from. At the last session, we talked about what the different stages of psychological development. The question was, who am I? And at different stages of psychological development, we have different ideas, different purposes, which have to do with where we are in the unfolding ego-soul dynamic in our lives. So let me start by saying we grow in stages of development. We covered that topic. We operate at levels of consciousness, and we live inside world views. So 2 weeks ago, I discussed stages of development. Today, I'm talking about levels of consciousness, and in 2 weeks' time, I'll talk about world views. So we have the whole picture. We grow in stages, we operate at levels, and we live inside world views. So everyone on the planet grows in stages of psychological development. Everyone operates from levels of consciousness. So the level of consciousness you normally operate from will be the same as the stage of psychological development that you are at. However, if something happens in your life, you may move down to a lower level of consciousness. It doesn't mean to say you go back to that stage of development. It just means that what you focus on would be the same as that earlier stage of development. So let me give you an example. If you're at the fourth stage of development, we discussed that 2 weeks ago, that's the individuating stage. Usually that's in mid-20s to late 30s. And suddenly you lose all your money and your investments. And so you'll drop down to the survival level of consciousness. You won't drop down to the surviving stage of development, but that's the baby, 0 to 2 years old, but you drop down to the survival stage level of consciousness. So I began over 20 years ago developing this tool for measuring consciousness by mapping values to different levels of consciousness. And I created this tool by building on Maslow's hierarchy of needs and extending it using Vedic philosophy that looks at different stages of self-actualization. So we have soul awareness, cosmic awareness, God awareness, and unity awareness. And I thought, well, if I slide that together with Maslow's survival, safety, self-esteem, transformation, self-actualization, we actually have a 7 levels of consciousness model. And that's exactly what I did. And you can find out about that by going to either the Barrett Values Center, valuecenter.com website, or to the my latest website, which is the Barrett Academy website. So everybody, as I say, is operating at a particular level of consciousness. Well, not only are you operating at a level of consciousness, but the organization that you work in is also operating at levels of consciousness, and so is the society or the nation in which you live. So there are personal levels of consciousness, there are organizational levels of consciousness, and there are societal levels of consciousness. And they all have 7 levels. There are all 7 levels to each of these different types of consciousness. I'm going to be talking mainly today about personal consciousness. So what's the first level of personal consciousness? Well, survival. It's the ultimate, really. It's like, how am I going to keep living? How do I get my needs met at the survival level? Do I have enough money to survive? Am I in a difficult situation where my survival might be in question? So survival is about how do I stay alive? It's also level of consciousness of our bodies, because our bodies are absolutely fine-tuned to staying alive. And so we have our physiological needs at the survival level, but we also have our basic needs of, well, how am I going to make enough money to feed my family and to get the things that I need, which are important. Also, at this survival level comes health. Looking after your health is very important. Now, one of the things I'm going to tell you is that different values belong at different levels of consciousness. So if you value health, that's a survival level of consciousness. And I mentioned in the notice I put out about this meeting that you can actually go online and map your values and find out which levels of consciousness you're operating from. And I'll give you that information before I finish. So what's the second level of consciousness? Well, the second level of consciousness has to do with relationships. But it has to do with relationships in the sense of protection, safety, and love. We all want to be loved. And the basic reason why we want to be loved is because A, we are actually souls having this human experience, but B, we want to feel protected. And if we don't feel loved, then we won't feel protected. So we need love in our lives. So this second stage, the second level of consciousness is about relationships. How do we get to feel safe and in this world that we're living in? Now, the next level of consciousness is self-esteem. And that means how do I feel about myself? How do I get recognized by other people? People will seek self-esteem in lots of different ways. There are three main ways in which we seek self-esteem, which actually align with the worldviews I'll be talking about 2 weeks from now. But self-esteem, the first way that we do it is through power and strength, and on the one hand, and looking beautiful on the other hand. I get my self-esteem through my physical body. So women are very inclined to seek their self-esteem by how they're looking. And men are very inclined to seek their self-esteem by bodybuilding. So we have this like physical aspect to our self-esteem. That's how we gain excess self-esteem. You may know people who spend a lot of time at the gym, focusing on bodybuilding. Well, this is part of the self-esteem. You may find people who, buy a lot of makeup, for example, and they really want to look good. Now, there's nothing wrong with these things. It's just that's how they seek self-esteem. Now, another way we seek self-esteem is through being clever. I mean being educated, having knowledge, going to university. And many people who go to university and stay on to do a PhDs are seeking self-esteem through knowledge. Again, nothing wrong with it. It's just different ways that we seek self-esteem. They want to be recognized for what they know. They want to be seen to be authorities or experts in their domain, and that's how they get self-esteem. And then there's a third way we get self-esteem. And so first of all, we seek strength and power. Then we seek acknowledgement through what we know. And finally, we seek self-esteem through wealth, through status, through influence. So we want to get on in the world. We want to put money in the bank. We want to have a flashy car. We want to have a big house. These are all status symbols that say to the world, I've arrived. And this is how some people want to focus on their self-esteem. Again, there's nothing wrong with any of these things, but you can notice from the friends that you have, even from yourself, which of these are you focusing on? How do you get your self-esteem? How do you get recognized by other people? So that's the self-esteem level. And next comes what we call the transformation level. This is linked to the individuating stage of development. It's about transformation in the sense of, well, I may have grown up with a lot of fears, but now I want to get rid of those fears and I want to find out who I am. And so this level takes a lot of courage, actually. It takes courage to look at yourself and say, well, who am I? What are the good aspects of my character? What are the things that I could improve? Getting feedback from other people. This is fundamentally important for the rest of your life, the transformation level, because it's all about continuous renewal and continuous learning. It's really important to always have some focus at this level. Now, what I didn't mention, and I'll just go back and mention that right now, the first three levels are all about how the ego feels. This fourth level I'm talking about is the transition from the ego to the soul. But for the first three levels, it's about ego. Now, there's a positive side to these first three levels of consciousness, and there's what I call a potentially limiting side. So if you're seeking self-esteem and you got feedback when you were young that you weren't up to much, or you weren't going to be successful, or that you may have adopted some limiting beliefs around that. And so there are some values, I call them values, but they're limiting values around these lower levels of consciousness. So, for example, at the relationship level, in order to feel good, you may blame other people. So blame is a value, but it's a limiting value. So power can also be a positive, but also a limiting value. If you want to have power over people in order to look good at the self-esteem level, that can be a limiting value. So we've got these positive values and we have limiting values during these first three levels of consciousness. So on the positive side, they help us to feel good about ourselves, and on the limiting side, we want to look good in other people's eyes. So we move to the transformation level, and this is about the courage to be who you are, face your fears, become fully owning your values, owning your beliefs. So sometimes this can be difficult because we have to separate ourselves from our families or our friends even who are stuck at the self-esteem level, and we want to move beyond that. So we go through the transformation level. From there we go to the internal cohesion level. This corresponds to the fifth stage of development. This is where I want to find a sense of meaning and purpose in my life. I want to explore my creativity. I want to be the best version of myself. So as we pass through the transformation level, we learn to be the best version. But then as we move into the internal cohesion level, we begin to align our ego motivations with our soul motivations, and the soul motivations at the internal cohesion level begin to dominate and begin to say, yeah, this is what I love to do. And I happen to be quite good at that, and this is what I want to focus on. So self-actualization is another word for this, but it's about this internal cohesion, a sense of I'm in the right place, doing the right thing. After internal cohesion, which you learn how to be who you really are and align with your soul motivations, comes the making a difference. I want to make a difference in the world. I've found my gifts and my talents at the previous level of consciousness, and now I want to make these gifts and talents available to the world. And as I've discussed in the last session, making a difference, really the important thing is connecting with other people. If you can't connect with other people, you're not going to be able to make a difference. So making a difference. This is also the level of where we begin to find our personal fulfillment, a sense of, we've got the sense of meaning and purpose in life. Now we're making a difference. And so we begin to feel a sense of fulfillment at this level of consciousness. And then we go to the seventh level of consciousness, which is really about serving the world, going beyond making a difference, but actually making a huge contribution, or even a small contribution. But we are thinking about future generations, for example. We're thinking about we're thinking about the environment. We're thinking about we're thinking about things like the crisis that we're going through, the climate change, and what we can do about that. So these are all different levels of consciousness that we can be operating from. And if you want to find out which levels of consciousness you're operating from, then you can do this free survey. It only takes about 5 or 10 minutes. You go online, you pick 10 values about which are important to you, and then 2 or 3 minutes later, you'll get a feedback report showing you which levels of consciousness you're operating from and a little description about who you are. Now, you can get this feedback by going to www.valuescenter.com/PVA. That's values, plural, center, CENTRE, values center, all one word, /PVA, personal values assessment. Now, on that same page where you go there, you'll find a 30-minute, I think it's about 20 to 30 minutes anyhow, self-learning exercise where you can take the results of your personal values assessment and you can dig in deeper and ask questions about the results that you got, and so you can have a deeper understanding about your values. Now, I'm looking away because I want to show you this book, Everything I Learned About Values. I brought this book out about a year ago, and it talks about personal values, it talks about organizational values, and it talks about societal values. It brings all of this together, and so it's a good book to read if you're really interested in values and how they play out in your world, how they play out in your organization, and how they play out in society. Now, organizations can have or do operate at different levels of consciousness, and we can measure that. It's using what's known as the cultural transformation tools. If you go to www.valuescenter.com, you can find out all about the cultural transformation tools. But basically, in an organization, the survival level is all about making money, but also about, if you're in a not-for-profit, it's about breaking even or having sources of income so you can actually do your work. And it's also about health of employees. At the relationship level, it's, as you might expect, it's about good internal relations between people and relations between the people in the company and people, the customers that you have, or the local community. At the self-esteem level in organizations, it's about performance. How well are we doing? How well are we performing? And not in terms of financial results, that's survival level, but at the self-esteem level as well. Are we efficient? Are we productive? These are important topics at the self-esteem level. So then we move to the transformation level. And this is the level where of teamwork. This is the level of, I'm beyond my ego now. I'm working with the other people, and I'm looking for us to work together in a team so that we can do a great job and get results. So this is where we move out of the ego. We begin to say, well, okay, how do we build a strong team? And not only that, how do we get a great sense of employee engagement? How do we actually talk to employees, and how do they talk to us and to the organization, so that everybody has a sense of they have a voice in the way in which things are being run? And internal cohesion in the organization is about having a shared vision, And shared values is what brings us all together. To what extent can we actually work together beyond a team, but actually now as a whole organization? What is it that allows us to be really a high-performing organization? So that's the internal cohesion level. We get to the making a difference level. Now that is the level of cooperation, coordination, because it's very difficult to make a difference on your own in an organization. You can if you're a leader, but most teams work together, so they have to collaborate with each other, and that's how they make a difference. And so this level of consciousness is also about how do we care for the environment in the way that we work. And then we get to the service level of consciousness in organizations, and that is, well, what is the impact that our organization has on the environment and beyond, and on what are we doing in terms of our social responsibilities? So in all of these cases, in the personal values, in the organizational values, and even in societal values, we can ask you to pick 10 values that are important to you, and these will then show up at different levels of consciousness. So that's it, basically. Levels of consciousness in a nutshell. It's like, how am I operating today? Now, as I said earlier on, different moods, different situations, events that happen can drive us down into the lower levels of consciousness. Now, these first 3 levels of consciousness that I mentioned are where the ego lives, in a sense, and there's a positive side and the limiting side. So whenever we have fears, we usually drop down into those first 3 levels. This is true as individuals, it's true for organizations, and it's true in society. Whereas the upper levels are much more about how do we work together? How do we go from what's in it for me to what's best for the common good? That's what the upper levels really are about. So those are the levels of consciousness. We operate at levels, we grow in stages, and next week, or not next week, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be talking about worldviews. So that's it from me today, and I hope you'll go online and see or do the personal values assessment. I hope you'll read the book, Everything I've Learned About Values. It'll give you an in-depth background to understanding how values are linked to the levels of consciousness that we're operating from. And if you want a document, if you write to info@Barrett Academy, info@Barrett Academy, then I'll send you a short article around the levels of consciousness. So that's it from me. It's a relatively short session today, but I think I've told you or given you a good introduction to levels of consciousness. So look forward to being with you in 2 weeks' time. Bye.